Good afternoon, all. I'm going to wait a minute here for our audience to build. Hope everyone is having a great afternoon. I'm checking on some of my. And by the way, we are simulcasting this, and so you may be seeing me live. If you're seeing me on LinkedIn Live, please get engaged in the chat. If you're seeing me on the Google Meet, I would ask that you mute yourself because I know not everybody has LinkedIn. And so we do have some guests on the Google Meet as well. So those on the Google Meet, please mute. But in the Google Meet, do feel free to incorporate in the chat. Also, if you're in the Google Meet and you have LinkedIn and you want to be more active in the chat, that chat is going to be one I'm going to be monitoring in real time. And so just be aware that the Gmail chat, the Google Drive chat's a little harder to navigate while I'm doing this broadcast. So, but we're going to wait about 2 minutes and then we're going to get things started off. Hello, Angie and Marty on the, I've got more on the Google side. Let me admit all those folks. Oh, Carolyn, Bobby, Bailey. Oh my gosh. Okay, lots of people on the Google Meet side. So if you're on the Google Meet side, welcome. We're going to wait about a minute or two to get the audience built over on the LinkedIn side. If you're interested in being in the chat that I'm going to be monitoring is on the LinkedIn side. And so you are free to get out of the calendar, the Google Meet through the calendar. You're more than welcome to hop out of that, go over to your LinkedIn, pull up this event because I'm going to be monitoring that very closely. And I'm going to be trying to do both at once. So bear with me on the technology here. And I'm trying to pull up my own LinkedIn so I can see how that's going. We're going to start in about 60 seconds. All right, here we go. So the LinkedIn audience is building. We are cooking now. All right, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, and or good morning. Hi from Chapel Hill, Justin. Hey, Michelle from Syracuse. Oh, excellent. Moved over here from Google. Great LinkedIn user. So good afternoon, but also good morning, because I know we might have some West Coast folks in here as well. I'm Alan Mueller. I'm the senior consultant at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. I founded Adaptive Challenge Consulting in 2014, so we're going on 12 years now. Committed to it full-time in 2021, then briefly took a full-time faculty, visiting faculty job, which slowed me down a little bit. But in earnest, I've been doing this full-time for about 2.5 years and part-time for about a dozen years. I also have some amazing affiliates, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But hello, and feel free to say hello and where you're from. But let's get into this. Extroverts leading introverts. So to start, we need to understand a little bit about well, first, here's me. This is my bio. Those of you who've seen me do keynotes or in-person trainings, you know that this is the slide I show people to make everyone think that I have my act together. And then the next slide is sort of the real Alan. But I have several degrees, a lot of them in sort of the psychology of learning, the psychology of growth and development. My master's degree is in what's called college student development, which is the developmental psychology of college students. My ed specialist degree is adult education, which emphasize how adults learn and also the barriers and the systemic things that they deal with. And then my doctorate's in educational leadership. I've done a lot of work in higher education, but also been in some other industries as well. This is the real Alan, right? The 7 and the 2.16. Those of you who've heard me talk are probably tired of this joke, but it took me 7 years to finish college the first time. 7 years. I was not the sort of classically motivated college student. My GPA when I finished was 2.16. So the joke I make when I'm in keynotes is a lot of my friends graduated magna cum laude or summa cum laude. I just graduated thank the laude. Like, can't believe this dude even made it. I love visiting Disney World. I'm part of 2 fraternities that you might not imagine if you just to look at me. One's a band nerd fraternity called Kappa Kappa Psi, KK Psi. The other one's Iota Phi Theta Fraternity Incorporated, which is the 5th largest historically Black fraternity in the U.S. Do not adjust your screen. I'm a white guy. I was an improv comedian for 8 years, and I do some other things on the side. But let's get into today's topic. Anytime we're going to talk about leadership, anytime we're going to talk about personality, we have to acknowledge that we have intersecting identities. It is just in the air. It is everywhere where we are. We can't talk about leadership because without understanding that gender is in the room, that race is in the room, that disability is in the room, that gender identity is in the room, that all the things that make us us are always in the room with us. Some of my intersecting identities are white. I'm white. I'm a man. I'm college educated. I'm middle class. I'm a U.S. citizen. There are other things about me that make up my identity. I don't ever get to leave the house and leave any parts of me at home. I don't ever leave the house and go, what if maybe I should leave white at home today? That doesn't work that way, right? We are all our full and whole selves. So from time to time, you might see this icon. We're talking about extroverts managing introverts, but some extroverts and every extrovert and every introvert probably has some experience of gender, some experience of race, etc. So as those things come up, we are going to take a natural little side rant for a minute, talk about it, and then come back. I hope that in today's webinar, you have an aha moment, something that you perceive that you cannot then unperceive. So one of the examples I give is if you are able to see the screen, the FedEx logo. I'm in Central North Carolina, and FedEx has a large presence where I am. And I see this logo a lot. And the FedEx logo, hidden within it, between the E and the X, the orange E and the orange X, hidden in the negative space is an arrow, So take a look at that in between the negative space. Every audience I speak to, somewhere between 25% and a third of every audience I speak to has a brand new aha moment when I point that out to them in the logo. In the chat, if this is the first time seeing the arrow, let me know. Be loud and proud about it. Like, this is the first time I've seen the arrow. Here's the reality. I hope that you get something from this webinar that you perceive that you can't unperceive, an aha that you can't un-aha. So that's my hope for you today during this webinar. So a note for anybody here who's more of our academic friends, right? And so I'm not an academic deep down in my bones, but I've gone through the gauntlet of getting some academic degrees. One thing to know is that the Myers-Briggs is based on Jung's work, Carl Jung, and that Carl Jung's work has been criticized, fairly so, about his methodology. And methodology is a fancy academic word to describe how did you set up your study to study what you want to study, right? And so at Jung's time, in Jung's context, we didn't have the advanced methodology understandings that we have now. And so if Jung took his study to an average university in the US and said, this is my proposed study, most of them would say, you don't pass. This study is not well put together enough. They would accuse him of doing what's called backyard research or something like that, where you're just studying folks that you have access to, right? He had clients in his psychotherapy analysis area, and he used them to form the foundations of this framework that then became the Myers-Briggs eventually under Isabella Briggs-Myers. So I fully understand that his methodology was not perfect. I fully understand that by today's standards, it would be qualitative, and qualitative research generally cannot be sort of generalized. However, as we dig into this and as we use his archetypes in their proper context, I think it's still a very, very valuable and useful tool. I also mentioned Isabella Briggs-Myers. Her name is Briggs-Myers, even though it's called the Myers-Briggs. That's because she wanted to honor her mother-in-law. But I do want to mention that I was made aware a few years ago of a work of fiction by Isabella Briggs-Myers that had some racist tropes, right? And so I want to acknowledge that, and to say that we have to acknowledge those things, and that I have to then, as I'm using this framework, I have to bring that lens with me. I have to bring the can I decolonize, can I deracialize this lens? Because this lens came from someone who, when she wrote a fiction story, used really damaging stereotypes, right? And I don't know the extent, I've never read the work, but I know that it's there, right? And so I want to acknowledge that. And so the bottom line is, based on both sort of the not perfect academic background and also Isabella Briggs-Myers attitudes, of racial attitudes, etc., we have to approach this framework with some care, right? And so, and that's what we plan to do. That's what I'm here to do. So if we approach this with intentionality and awareness, it can still be a very valuable tool for leaders and managers. So, but I wanted to note that because it's important to talk about. What is preference? If you got a scrap piece of paper with you, I would invite you to try this. Write down your first and last name, but use your non-preferred hand. I'm going to do it with you real quick. I have a scrap piece of paper here, and I'm going to use a Sharpie so y'all can all see it. Oh my gosh. I make people do this all the time, and I never really have to do this. Oh, this is very challenging. And I'm just going to do my first name because I'm facilitating this webinar. Yeah. This is my first name when written with my left hand. Yeah. P.S. When my children were like 2 and 3 and needed to give my wife a Mother's Day card, I wrote those with my left hand. It was brilliant. Anyway, so I ask you to write your name with your non-preferred hand, your non-dominant hand, because I want to first establish what preference is and what preference isn't. Preference in the Jungian terms is just this subconscious go-to. Uh, I'm guessing that if you wrote something with your non-dominant hand, you were able to write it to some degree. I mean, like mine's somewhat legible, but I can assure you it was less comfortable for me than normal. And I think that's probably common. I bet that if you wrote with your non-dominant hand, you would describe it as, yeah, I can do it, but it's less comfortable than usual. This is what we mean by preference. If your boss in your workplace, if you're right-handed, for example, and if your boss at your workplace said, well, from here on out, we're not going to do emails anymore. We're only going to do handwritten memos, and everybody has to write left-handed for the next 6 months. Would it be uncomfortable? Yes. Are you capable of it? Sure. Would you get better at it as you went? Definitely. So this is important to talk about because right-handed and left-handed is one example of preference. I've never done anything to encourage right-handedness among my children, and yet both of my children miraculously came out right-handed. They just are right-handed. And so I want to make sure that we establish that, because right-handed and left-handed is a preference that we understand that we don't ascribe a lot of other behaviors to, right? When we start talking about extroverts and introverts, we start ascribing behaviors to these folks. But friends, extroverts and introverts, that's not a behavior thing. It's a preference thing only. One of the things I like about the Myers-Briggs, I shared some criticism on the last slide. One of the things I like about it is it's only measuring preference. There's a lot of instruments out there, like the DISC, I think StrengthsFinders to some degree, that are trying to measure how good you are at something. Well, self-reporting instruments aren't the best for that. If I took a self-reporting instrument on how good of a driver I was, I would give myself a 10 out of 10. My wife might disagree that I'm a 10 out of 10 driver as the person who rides around with me the most, because my ability to honestly critique my skill at something is inherently flawed. It's inherently flawed. But my ability to critique something I have a preference for is not flawed. I can tell you I have a preference for coffee. Exhibit A. I have a preference for coffee, right? I don't know if you noticed that. I'm gonna do that one more time though, because I'm a little silly and ridiculous, but check this out. It's my right hand right here. Watch this, watch this. I'm right-handed. Uh-oh, what's he doing? Okay. I use my left hand to drink a cup of coffee. I want this image with you, because when we talk about right-handedness and left-handedness, we almost never think, well, only right-handed people can do this and only left-handed people can do this, except for scissors, maybe, right? But with extroversion and introversion, we quickly go from, you have an extrovert preference or you have an introvert preference, we quickly go to, well, you can and can't do this, or should or shouldn't be doing this. And that's not what this is about. This is why I do what I do, because we've been using it wrong, right? Saying someone has an extrovert preference means you know a little bit about one piece of their subconscious psychological preference. And if they have an introvert preference, you know one piece of it, right? Similarly, in popular conversation, I've heard people say, I've said, oh, this person's so extroverted or so introverted. In Jung's framework and in Isabella Briggs Myers' writings, there's no such thing as so extroverted or so introverted. It would be as though I said to you, oh my gosh, do you know Suzanne? She is so left-handed. Like, I don't think most of us would ever qualify left-handed or right-handed with like a modifier, like, oh, he is so right-handed. No, you're right-handed or you're left-handed. It's an on-off switch. And at the fundamental base of Jung's framework, as codified by Isabella Briggs Myers, it is an on-off switch. It's extroversion and introversion. I frequently get questions about ambiversion, and we can talk about that a little bit. But my theory about what ambiversion represents is, and I've been certified in use of the Myers-Briggs for almost 20 years now. I think I got certified in 07 or 08. And I've been using this with universities and corporations and nonprofits and city governments. And one of the things I can tell you is that in my experience, people who identify as ambiverts tend to be people who actually have introvert preferences, who have learned that if they act more extroverted, that they are going to navigate their workspaces better. That it's sort of like adopting a second language. They turn on the social switch, they turn on the extrovert switch so they can function better, sometimes in a family dynamic, sometimes in a work dynamic, sometimes in other dynamics. And so extroverts, meanwhile, are almost never pressured to act more introverted, right? So most times when people say to me, I think I'm an ambivert, I engage in conversation, I ask them some questions. And ultimately, most often, I find that they really have a preference for introversion and that in fact they are what I call the social introverts, the introverts who have learned to speak extrovert fluently because they have to, so they don't get lost in the shuffle at work, right? Um, Cauliflower and coffee is an example I give sometimes when I do these talks about. I do not like cauliflower. I just don't. I don't know, and I don't know that anybody can convince me of it. Similarly, I'm sure that there's someone on this call who doesn't like coffee. That is very, very hard for me to understand that anybody wouldn't like coffee. And yet that's also a fundamental part of preference, is that when we have a preference, whether it's coffee or cauliflower, or think of your favorite food or your least favorite food, it's hard to imagine the opposite. It is hard for me to imagine not liking coffee. It's very hard for me to imagine not liking coffee. It's equally hard for me to imagine loving cauliflower. So if we get into talking about extroversion and introversion, which is not just a preference for a single food or for a single taste, but it's a preference for how we energize ourselves in the working world, at home, etc. That's a pretty big thing to be able to honestly say, I honestly don't understand the opposite of that. And that's part of why we're having this conversation. I'm someone who has an extrovert preference, and I've spent the better part of 20 years trying to understand people with introvert preferences better. And I'm still not there. I'm getting closer, but I'm still not there, right? Because it is an experience that's so different than my experience that I have to listen a lot more. I have to pay more attention. I have to suspend a lot of my assumptions to really understand. And that can help me with leading and managing, which is where we're gonna go next. By the way, anytime we're talking about dichotomies, extroversion and introversion, the second one is sensing and intuition. The third one is feeling and thinking. The last one is judging and perceiving. Anytime we're talking about dichotomies, remember, you can use both hands. If you're right-handed, when I drive my truck, I use two hands. I'm right-handed, but I use both. Do I have an extrovert preference? Yes. Do I know that there are situations where if I adopt a more introverted affect, a more introverted way of trying to approach things, that might benefit me in terms of doing work better, supporting people better, etc.? Yeah. The thinking and feeling dichotomy, the third one, is particularly mushy when it comes to how we make decisions, because most of us use principles and care about people, sort of like driving a car with two hands. So as we start talking about this, just understand that you can have a preference for right-handedness. You can totally use your left hand if you need it, and you can totally use both hands. So the Myers-Briggs is about preferences, and the preference version of that is if somebody tosses me a pen and says, Alan, write this down, I do not pause and go, which hand am I going to use? No. When someone throws me a pen and says, write this down, subconsciously, I already know I'm going to my right hand, and I'm just going to write it down with my right hand. So that's what the Myers-Briggs is. It's these subconscious preferences that are happening when we're not analyzing, when we're not overthinking things or thinking about them consciously. I mentioned these dichotomies. It's an 8-part series. Today, it's about extroverts managing introverts. Next week, it's about introverts managing extroverts. The next two after that, which I'll reference a little later, are about intuitives and sensing folks. They're not called intuition and sensing. The intuition one is called, why is my supervisor a micromanager? Because many people with intuitive preferences who have supervisors who are sensing feel like they're being micromanaged. Flip it, many people who are sensing people managed by intuitive people think that their managers' heads are in the clouds, that they're not paying attention, that they don't have attention to detail. So we're going to get into this as we go. So yeah, again, I'm going to use preferences and people with introvert preferences as much as possible, but sometimes I'm going to slip up. Sometimes I'm going to say extroverts and introverts, and it's just going to happen. But this slipping up is part of why in most of our understanding of the Myers-Briggs that we use it to ascribe things instead of describe, ascriptive language versus descriptive language. In other words, we sort of say, well, that person's an extrovert, as though that's sort of all they are, or that implies they're going to behave a certain way. Descriptive, that's ascriptive. Descriptive is, I think that person has a preference for extroversion. So all other things being equal, they might want to be around other people to energize, right? But all other things aren't always equal, right? So understand that even if I say extroverts and introverts, what I mean is people with extrovert preferences and people with introvert preferences. And that is so important to understand when we're talking about type, because this shouldn't be a label. This shouldn't be a label. This should be one way of understanding one aspect of you. And then the Myers-Briggs lines up 4 different aspects and calls it a type. But I'm less interested in the type, and I'm more interested in each of these aspects so that you can understand them, because it can make you a better leader and a better manager. And so we're going to get into that pretty soon. So understand that sometimes I'll still use that shorthand that I don't like because it's overused and it gets us in trouble. But ultimately, what I mean is, when I say extrovert, I mean people who happen to have an extrovert preference, or people who happen to have an introvert preference. I hope that's clear. And that's an important thing to just understand about all type conversations. I'm going to pause real quick, look in the chat. Is there any conversation, any questions? I'm going to try to look also at the Google Meet chat and see if there's anybody in there on the chat. Any questions so far about what we're talking about? And I know there's a slight delay on the LinkedIn side. So, all right. I am going to press on. Again, I mentioned extroversion and introversion. This is a preference about where we get our energy when all of the things are equal. If you stick with me through the whole 8-part series, then this other things being equal, you'll understand what I mean by that. But let me give you one quick example. I'm someone with an extrovert preference, but my second letter is intuitive, and my third letter is feeling. Now, if you're unfamiliar, in general, intuitive folks tend to absorb the world around them through patterns, what they call an Ed theory schema. They tend to find patterns and be very interested in systems and how things connect as they absorb the world through intuition. And then feeling means I'm very person oriented. I'm oriented towards the good of people, etc. So if I'm an extrovert, that means I get my energy from other people. One time, my wife had some of her friends from school over for a party, and she said, "Well, go into that other room and do the thing you do. Go be social." And when I say all other things being equal, what I mean is she's an introvert, has an introvert preference, and she sees me as an extrovert as having some magical gift to just be able to talk to people. But what she doesn't understand is that I'm still an intuitive person and I'm still a feeling person. And those two things together ask me, oh, you want to energize from people, but are they your people? Are they your kind of people? The intuition and the feeling shows up, and they make not all other things equal in terms of how I socialize. So that's one little example. There's so many more examples of that. But understand that when I say the phrase, when all of the things are equal, you're a complex individual that has not just a preference for extrovert, introvert, sensing, intuition, thinking and feeling, judging and perceiving. You have a gender, you have a race, you have an ability status, you have a probably an opinion about what constitutes real barbecue and what doesn't. Sorry, Texas friends, I don't understand brisket. I'm open to learning more. I just don't understand it yet because I'm from North Carolina. And in North Carolina, when you say barbecue, I know what we mean because I have that cultural context. So there are all of these preferences that make us outside of that. So when I say the phrase, all other things being equal, understand the other things are rarely equal. However, this understanding can still help us get better at leading. Supervisor dynamics. Yes, Haley. So one other thing you'll notice here is I've got the DEI and belonging icon here. One thing I need to explain is that introversion and extroversion as preferences aren't neutral. For one, Isabella Briggs Myers says that our society celebrates extroverts more than introverts, and I believe that. I see that in my experience. She talks about extrovert preference as the privileged preference, and I totally get that. I think people with extrovert preferences likely get promoted at a higher rate, sometimes probably get listened to more, sometimes are seen as more of an authority in some ways. And so that's one aspect. Another is that this intersects gender in a big way. When I do workshops, I'll often separate folks into extroverts on one side and introverts on the other side, people with extrovert preferences, people with introvert preferences. And I'll ask the room if they're familiar with the phrase resting Mitch face with an M, resting Mitch face. And of course, they're probably not. I think there's a comedian, it might have been Kevin Hart. Kevin Hart, I think, referenced that, but it's not a big phrase in a lot of our consciousness, but we know what it rhymes with. And what it rhymes with is a stereotype that women who happen to be introverts have to deal with, that men who happen to be introverts somehow don't have to deal with. I've been alive more than 50 years, and no stranger has ever approached me and told me I need to smile more, right? And so part of that is that I'm an extrovert, but a bigger part of that is that I'm a man. And so I want to say here that introversion and extroversion in your office space, in where you work, that these have real overlaps with gender. They also have overlaps with race, y'all. Because if all women who happen to have an introvert preference are dealing with the why don't you smile more, resting, RBF, whatever. If all of them are dealing with that baseline of stereotypes, you add in if it's a Black woman, if it's a Latina woman, you add a bonus set of stereotypes. I'm saying bonus like it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing. But there are extra stereotypes that we project in our minds. Oh, well, she has an attitude or this or that, right? And so I challenge all of you, particularly if you're an extrovert listening right now, and you perceive introverts in a certain way, challenge yourself to think about introverts who happen to be women, introverts who happen to be women who are also Black or Latine or other women of color, because the stereotypes stack on each other. And if you want to be an effective manager as an extrovert to introverts, you need to interrogate that within yourself. And again, I'm not immune to those stereotypes in my brain, but having this knowledge and this language helps me knock it down as soon as it shows up, right? I grew up in misogyny. I grew up in racism. I grew up in these things. And so this is real. But equipping us with this language as leaders and managers can help us disrupt those stereotypes. If at any point people have questions, chime in, because we're about to get to the meaty part of how folks with extrovert preferences can lead folks with introvert preferences. Real quick though, in the chat, I would love for those to chime in. If you happen to know your preference, extroversion and introversion, put an E or an I. I would love to know sort of a little bit about who's in this audience. Part of me imagines that most of this audience might be people with extrovert preferences. However, it might not be, right? But yeah, if you know and feel like sharing whether you have a preference for extroversion or a preference for introversion, put an E in there or put an I in there, so that I know a little bit about who we're talking about or who I'm talking with today. So one of the things to think about is when I ask introverts and extroverts, when I'm in a large room and I say, what do we think when we think extroverts? I get two kinds of answers. Extroverts will answer about themselves, oh, outgoing, gregarious, friendly. Introverts sometimes will be like loud, overbearing, etc. But then the introverts will also say talkative, life of the party, etc. And so there's an interesting way when we think about how introverts and extroverts each perceive themselves and the other, and the stereotypes that can show up, right? Oh, thanks. E, I. Okay, a fair amount of introverts. ENFP, Marty, over on the Google chat. So ENFP, Marty, you and I can start the party later. We're probably going to forget cups and ice, but we can start it. Yeah, the ENFPs, that's what we do. But so understand that when people with introvert preferences are asked to, in their own words, describe people with extrovert preferences, they're describing their experience of them, which is not an internal experience. It's their experience of working with them. And so loud, it talks too much, overbearing, doesn't know when to shut up. These kinds of things show up. So if you are someone with an extrovert preference, which I'm realizing a lot more of you have introvert preferences, but if you have a manager with extrovert preferences and he, she, or they is able to increase how aware they are, if they're able to laugh at, man, extroverts, we talk so much, am I right? You know, that kind of thing, where if you can start laughing at yourself, that's a great way towards self-awareness. And I use this in some conversations when it comes to race too, when it comes to gender, that any group that has sort of a privileged status, and trust me when I say, if you're someone with an extrovert preference who ever navigated formal education in the form of high school or college and saw a syllabus that said class participation this many points, that's privilege, my friends, where every time as someone with an extrovert preference, I saw on a syllabus, class participation, 20 points, I immediately thought to myself, woohoo, free points, like free points. Meanwhile, people with introvert preferences may have stress or anxiety about that. Or maybe if it's not stress or anxiety, still have to expend some mental energy. How much talking will I need to do to get the points? How much are those points worth? Can I get the grade I want without all of those points, etc.? So most certainly understand that people with introvert preferences use certain language to describe people with extrovert preferences that is about how extroverts tend to show up, but it's not about what's happening on the inside. Kind of like my wife saying, oh, go be social. Well, I'm more than just an extrovert. In this case, I'm an intuitive, I'm a feeler. And I want to know, if before I'm social with someone, I want to know, are these my kind of people? Because intuition and feeling are screaming at me, are these your kind of people, right? If my middle two letters were different, if I were sensing and thinking, my question before I go to socialize might not be, are these my kind of people? The question might be, could we get some networking done? Could we get some business done? Could we accomplish something? So when I say all other things being equal, if you stick with me for all 8 sessions, you're going to figure out how these unequal things show up. And it's once you map it, it's so great. So how can we equip extroverts to lead introverts better? I'm going to give you, I think I've got 4 slides with some practical tips. If you're an extrovert leader and you're engaging in some brainstorming, send an email to your team in advance about the topic you're planning to discuss. Give them some lead time, right? For me, last time I had led a staff, it was a smaller staff, so I didn't do that email. Instead, that morning, I would walk through the halls and I would stop by the different offices, particularly with folks who I knew had an introvert preference. I'd say, hey, just so you know, we're going to be talking about such and you may have seen it on the agenda, but number 5, we're really going to be talking about it. So I would love to hear your thoughts. telegraphing that to them in advance of the meeting is valuable. It's valuable because people with introvert preferences tend to process internally, and that internal processing takes a few seconds or a minute or whatever. Meanwhile, some extrovert managers are talking so quickly that by the time they've asked the question, they've answered it, some other extrovert has answered it, and it's not really getting all the voices incorporated. So one great technique is sending an email in advance, or if it's a smaller staff, knocking on a few doors and saying, hey, I really would love to hear your thoughts when we talk about this at staff meeting today. So those kinds of things where you're giving just a little prep time, right? And so circulate note cards. Say you don't have time to do that email ahead of time, or say you don't have time to walk down the hall and sort of telegraph to folks with introvert preferences that you want their opinions about a certain subject so they can start thinking about it in advance. Hand out some note cards. Say, we're gonna brainstorm about this project, and I'd like you to jot down 2 or 3 ideas. Something that this does is, number one, it makes space for people with introvert preferences, and number two, it slows down people with extrovert preferences. People with extrovert preferences get foot in mouth a lot, right? And it's because they are externally processing simultaneously to their internal processing a lot of the time until they train themselves to do otherwise. This index card idea, jot down 3 ideas, can be a great equalizer. Let's, instead of just assuming that we all brainstorm verbally, let's assume that we brainstorm in different ways, and let's start with, if you're an extrovert preference person, let's start with the way that's not my way, to make more space for other voices. Also break into small groups. When I do facilitations, when I do leadership training, I often, if I'm doing like a 4-hour training, the first time there's any kind of discussion, I do note cards. The second time there's any kind of discussion, I do small group. Then the third time there's any kind of discussion, I do big group. Because I understand that for people with introvert preferences, that the first thing with the note card is I'm attempting to build some trust. Then the small group is attempting to get them a little out of their comfort zone. And then the big group conversation will flow more naturally, right? Because there's been a kind of an on ramp, right? It's sort of like getting extroverts to be quiet, on ramp as well, right? So that's one set of tips when it comes to the brainstorming end of things. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Here's the next part: when giving tasks. Oh my gosh. Again, send an email with details to the project in advance of a one-on-one meeting. Now, in I think either the next slide or the slide after, we're going to talk a little bit about the second letter of the Myers-Briggs, because this bullet point here, sending an email with details, it speaks to our preference for introversion and extroversion, because people with an introvert preference might prefer a little bit more time to know what we're talking about in the one-on-one. But it also speaks to your second letter, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, because your second letter in the Myers-Briggs is how you absorb information. And half the people you work with want a detailed outline, and the other half want a story that speaks to them, their work, and their experience, right? The sensing is give me the details, give me the outline. The intuitive is give me the big picture connected to my work, connected to something meaningful to me in how you communicate about giving this task. And so understand that introvert, extrovert, all other things are not equal, because each person with an introvert preference also has a preference for sensing or intuition. But we'll get into that as we go. Even so, people with introvert preferences generally could use a little more time. Put time in between the introduction of a project and conversations about implementation. Put some time in there, right? Give folks time to acclimate, to think, particularly if it's a project about reorganizing, if it's a larger project about larger scale offerings that your office does, if things have to shift. And remind them that particularly if you have an extrovert preference, which I'm realizing a lot of the folks on this group don't have an extrovert preference, but particularly if you have an extrovert preference, remind them that if they come up with questions later, it's never a problem for them to come to you, right? So this is important, because a lot of times office cultures suggest we should ask the questions now, or there's an embarrassment factor later, or something like that later, or it's if I have questions later, I don't want to bug the person, they're busy. There are all of these other things we tell ourselves, that if you want to be a more effective manager, and you are a manager who is an extrovert, who is leading introverts, making it explicit that you fully expect questions to come up later, and that you're ready for those questions later, to demystify the, am I bothering this person? Am I bugging this person? So telegraphing that specifically is exceptionally valuable, because people with introvert preferences might process things in a deeper way, and that deeper way might take some more time. And again, I'm talking about behaviors. Introversion is not a behavior, but it's a preference. And that preference leads to some kinds of behaviors. It's a constellation. All introverts are different, but it can lead to a deeper dive in trying to analyze tasks. Um, when thinking about team bonding and morale, oh my goodness. Many people with extrovert preferences, they're like, oh yeah, hey y'all, we're gonna go do a low ropes course together. We're gonna spend 8 hours in the woods together. Meanwhile, many of the people with introvert preferences on their staffs are going, oh no, like what? Please no, please no, please no. Um, and so one of the things to understand is that if you're someone with an extrovert preference who leads a team that's made up of introverts and extroverts, that's the most common, right? Is that you have one preference and your team is split among, with the exception of maybe certain kinds of industries or certain kinds of areas. If you work for a company and you're on the sales side, you're probably going to have a few more extrovert preference folks. If you work with people and you're more on the data analytics side, you might have more introvert preference folks. Again, might not, but generally, many of us are managing people with introvert preferences and extrovert preferences. So here's some ways to do team building and morale building. And I am not opposed to a low ropes course. I am not opposed to team building activities. But just like I said earlier, how I start with a note card, then go to a small group conversation, then a larger group conversation. When it comes to team building and morale, you can use the same techniques. You need to establish trust, establish that it's a kind of a safe social environment for people with introvert preferences to be more of themselves, because that takes some energy, likely, right? So one great thing you could do is, if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go drop $3,500 to do a team building thing, I'm going to bring my buddy Alan in, he's going to do some team building, but before you drop $3,500, go, wait a second, I could get $350 worth of coffee gift cards. I could create a little rotation of people in my office where everybody in my office gets 5 free coffees with someone they don't know in the office, right? This might be for mid-size and larger groups. And they have to complete them in a month. And it's not perfect. Like all people with introvert preferences are not going to go like, oh, that's great. But if you explain, I'm trying to build morale, I'm trying to build team. And before we go do something that's loud and where we have to do all the talking and the high ropes and the low ropes and the team, but before we do any of that, let's do some team building and some morale in one-on-one or two-on-one situations, right? Where you provide some resources and some time for your team to get to know each other in a smaller social situation. And be explicit about this. Be like, hey, I want us to build team and I want us to build morale. And the easiest thing is to carve out a Friday afternoon and go to the woods and play with a facilitator, right? However, that's not everyone's primary way of building morale and team bonding, right? So if you are doing those big team bonding things, build in some downtime. I worked at Salem College with these amazing orientation leaders, and these orientation leaders were, hold on just a second, pause for 30 seconds. Unpause. My blood sugar is crashing. I got some crackers. Sorry if y'all don't like Ritz crackers. I worked with these amazing students at Salem College. We did orientation programming. And one of the things, they did some training about introversion and extroversion. And one of the things that they came across is that one of their large team building activities was very extrovert centric. We would take the entire incoming class to a camp about 35 minutes north of campus. And they had this giant outdoor covered gym area, and we'd play basketball and volleyball and all of these things. And this year that I was working with them, they said, what if we had a quiet table? And what if we also had a craft table? And I was like, that's brilliant. It's brilliant. Because one of the myths that extrovert folks tell ourselves is that people with introvert preferences don't want to be included. Because many extroverts project, if I've invited this person this many times and they've said no, then that no means they don't want to be included. But then the question is, included in what? Included in what? Included in what kind of environment? Have you created an environment because inviting someone and being inviting are different. Inviting someone to the team building activity is one thing. Making sure the team building activity itself is an inviting environment is a different standard. So understand that even when you're doing large team building and morale kinds of things, build in downtime. Will the extroverts sometimes get frustrated or bored? Yes. Okay, great, fine, because many of them are not having anxiety about going to a team building activity anyway, right? So understand that there are ways to structure team bonding and morale events that take people with introvert preferences into account. And then also work with your extrovert preference colleagues to get them to show more awareness, right? Because trust me, some introvert preference folks, and again, when all other things are equal, and here's an example of all other things not being equal. One of my dearest friends is someone with an introvert preference. My wife is someone with an introvert preference. I don't think my wife actually ever gets tired of talking with me because I'm one of her people. I'm one of her insiders, right? Many people with extrovert preferences don't quite understand how people with introvert preferences start to build an inner circle, right? And when I tell people with extrovert preferences about this, they're like, oh, inner circle, I get that in the abstract. And me, as someone who's an extrovert, I get it in the abstract. But I've come to believe, after listening and listening and listening to many folks with introvert preferences, I've come to believe that it's bigger than just an abstract concept, that it's almost sacred to some people in some ways. That once someone has earned your trust, that they're in, and that's when you don't have to guard your energy anymore, right? Among the forest of extroverts you're around all the time. So I think it's such a privilege when I've had friends who have an introvert preference who, when I'm around them, talk nonstop. I love that because it's an honor, because it means I'm in, right? But if you're a manager who has an extrovert preference, understand that as you coach other extroverts, the degree to whether you're perceived by your introvert colleagues, you're coaching, like say I'm coaching an extrovert, and I say, hey, some of your introvert colleagues think you talk too much. And if they don't, that probably means you're in with them. And you need to differentiate that. You need to understand that. You can even ask, right? Am I talking too much? And then after the polite, you can be like, no, hold on. I'm trying to be more self-aware. Am I actually talking too much right now? Yeah. Y'all, I'm going to tell you the funniest thing, one of the funniest things about being Alan, because I do consulting, I fly all over the country. Like last week, I was in Indiana, and then I was in Tampa, and then I was in Orlando, and pretty soon I'm going to Richmond and then California. And when I get on flights, because I'm very aware of type, sometimes I'll say to the person next to me, hey, are you the kind of person that enjoys talking to strangers on planes or doesn't? And before they answer, I'll say, by the way, I have an audiobook. I'm totally fine listening to that. But I also like to get to know strangers sometimes. And if you're open to it, we could talk a little bit. You could decide if you want to keep talking. And then we could just, if we don't want to keep talking, that's fine. And the rest of the flight, we could be like, I say out loud the things that I think all of us are probably thinking when we sit next to a stranger on a plane. And I'm just making it transparent. Does it strike people as a little odd? Maybe. If we all started doing it, might all of our lives be a little better? Maybe. Might we not feel the pressure? I have to be polite and let this person talk when I really don't want to talk to them. If that person had the awareness to say, hey, do you like to talk to strangers on planes? Plus, when I ask that question, I'm very aware of my gender. I'm very aware of my race. I'm very aware of the other things that make me me as I'm asking that question. So coaching those other extroverts as well. If you have any questions or any comments, please chime in. We're almost at the end. I referenced this a few slides ago, but that last bullet point is gonna sort of segue us to talking about the future workshops here in this series. So when giving feedback, when appropriate, send a basic outline of what you're wanting to talk about in advance. Now, you may have heard a few minutes ago, I mentioned that introversion could be a preference, but that second letter of sensing and intuition speaks very much to how I want the feedback. In other words, think of it this way. If you're a manager who's an extrovert, that giving feedback to someone with an introvert preference, meet them in their introversion in terms of how you're preparing them timeline-wise for that feedback. When it comes to the form of the feedback, whether it's a bullet point list or whether it's a paragraph, that's where that second letter of sensing and intuition comes into play. So as we get more into understanding this, you'll understand that the first two letters of the Myers-Briggs in particular are the most powerful when it comes to leading and managing. The third and fourth letter are great. They add a lot of nuance and a lot of context. But the first two letters, when it comes to actually leading and actually managing, are the power letters. And so understanding this extrovert introvert dichotomy and the second dichotomy are the most powerful tools. When giving feedback, less is more. Most people with introvert preferences will find space filling talk to make things uncomfortable, even if you as an extrovert supervisor are doing space filling talk because you're uncomfortable with silence. That's the weird part about this dichotomy, y'all. First 3 years of my marriage, I was constantly asking my wife, who has an introvert preference, are you mad? Is something wrong? What's wrong? Are you okay? Because I projected that silence meant there was a problem, right? There wasn't a problem. That was a natural state for someone with an introvert preference. So understand that when giving tough feedback in particular, people will feel awkward. Both the supervisor and supervisee will sometimes feel awkward. When people feel awkward, people with extrovert preferences tend to fill up the space with noise. People with introvert preference want the silence, and each of those is the other one's kryptonite. Oftentimes, the fact that we have the phrase awkward silence speaks to how focused and centered we are on extra needs, on the needs of people with preferences. The fact that we have what's called awkward silences, but I don't know the similar phrase for awkward over talking. I don't know if there's a phrase, if one of y'all know, because it seems like there's a lot of folks with introvert preferences in here. But yeah, less is more. The next one is seek to understand their second Myers-Briggs letter. And again, I've mentioned this, sensing and intuition to customize the way you are speaking to them. If I'm speaking to someone who has an introvert preference, who has a sensing preference, if my language is too flowery, if I'm saying too many words to say one concept, they're not going to respond as well. The sensing person wants it more direct. Their preference is to have it more direct, more outlined and more organized. The intuitive will appreciate you giving context as you go. I've noticed this in your behavior and this in your behavior. I've also noticed you've done, they'll appreciate more fill-in context that intuitive people tend to give. And they will seek that as well. If you're curious about this dichotomy, because this is one of the most powerful ones when it comes to communicating to folks that you're supervising, or really anybody, those two webinars, next week's is just about introverts leading extroverts. We're flipping this script. But then the following 2 weeks are those. My coworkers are overly vague and my supervisors are always micromanaging. So those two, I said sensing and intuitive. Sensing people often think their intuitive supervisors are overly vague. And this shows up in HR exit interviews. I work with a lot of HR teams. And these HR teams, when I talk about in their exit interviews, I'm like, yeah, what are some of the themes? That's a common theme. And the other one is my supervisor micromanaged me. Y'all, there's a type to this. People with an intuitive preference, whose managers and leaders and supervisors have a sensing preference. And because they have a sensing preference, they want to give a lot of detail when giving feedback, when giving instruction on a project or a task. Intuitive folks, by default, because that's not their preference for absorbing information, might feel micromanaged just by the setup. And so this feeling micromanaged or feeling your supervisor is vague, these are the most common ways that sensing and intuitive preferences show up in our conversation. So a little kind of advanced, you can find the RSVP information on my website, but those two are coming up. So I'm going to pause here. I know that the LinkedIn is on a little bit of delay for questions, and then I've got a few more things to share right before we wrap up, and I'm going to eat one more cracker so I don't pass out on y'all, because y'all don't want that. I have the LinkedIn over here so I can tell when the delay happens. And I can tell when I've shut up and let y'all put things in the chat, because I'm a little far ahead. Well, if questions roll in, they roll in, but I will press on. This is the series week. It is all about people with introvert preferences managing extroverts and some of what that's about. I do my company, Adaptive Challenge Consulting. We have this thing called the ACC 10 Factor. It's like a 360 assessment. But the thing that's so cool about this is we take the assessment and we temper it with personality type. Because, for example, one of the dynamics that we're asking is, how effective is your supervisor at communicating with you? How effective? Teams that I'm working with, I can tell them before they've administered the survey to their whole team. I can tell them, if you have folks with introvert preferences who are managing larger teams of extrovert preference folks, they're going to score lower on that. Because many people with extrovert preferences will project onto the word communicates effectively, they will think, well, effectively includes the frequency of the communication. And many extroverts think their introvert managers aren't communicating enough with them. And the inverse is true. If we're not able for the Michelle, yes, send me an email at info@adaptivechallengeconsulting.com and I'll show you where you can get the replays. Yep. They'll all eventually be on my website, but in the short term, they stick around on LinkedIn for a little while. Yeah. But so next week we're flipping the script, introverts managing extroverts, and then we're going to get into the other ones. This graphic is not in order of date. It's in order of colors that I wanted to not seem too repetitive. I got artsy with this one. So, but if you go to my site, you'll see the entire series, or also on LinkedIn, adaptivechallengeconsulting.com. If you just go to events, it's the next 7 events. Couple other things. We have some books. My first book is that one in the middle, Leading with Emotional Intelligence, if you're curious. Also, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kelly Dixon, collaborated with Dr. Green. I think Dr. Green was on the call. What's up, Dr. Green? They have an amazing book. It's on my shelf right now, and I've read it. It's fantastic. It's called The Disruptive Leader. And these 2 books, we didn't write them intentionally to complement each other, but shockingly, they just do. And so it's a really cool kind of 1-2 thing. And you can get both books together on my website. And Dr. K and Dr. Green are just both phenomenal facilitators, and Dr. K is one of the affiliates with Adaptive Challenge Consulting, and Dr. Green, I think, is now a friend as well. And then my new book is called Improv Comedy and the Art of Leadership. For those of you who don't know, I was an improv comedian for about a decade. I incorporated that into my practice. I taught it at the college level. And so if you're curious about some reading. Also, speaking of affiliates, this is my team right here, amazingly talented folks. If your team is thinking about some professional development workshops, some workshops on leadership, communication, inclusion in the workforce, having difficult conversations, y'all, the amount of talent represented by these 6 folks is mind-blowing. And so and then I'm part of the team too, right? So all 7 of us, right? We all have these talents that we bring. And so my affiliates, when companies or city governments or universities or K-12 schools, when they approach me and they start talking about their outcomes, I'm immediately going, okay, for this one, I want to talk to Taishay, or I want to talk to Dr. Deming, or I want to talk to Chris. And so along the way, we fill those gaps. And so if you're interested in some professional development, connect with us. And speaking of connecting, this is a great way to connect. Y'all, we have 9 bonus minutes. I don't know about you, but I always love 9 bonus minutes because it means I get to do some other things. And so first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for attending this. I also want to invite you to RSVP to the other events, and invite some friends. I would love to have this conversation be even more robust. And so thank you for the thoughtful comments and questions that you offered. Thank you for participating. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your Myers-Briggs types. I can tell I have a fair amount of folks with folks that use that have introvert preferences. Somebody says, which system do you use? My company uses Gallup. Ramel, I'm not sure if I understand the question as far as what system I use, but I do use a Jung-based typology that is very similar to the Myers-Briggs. I use a Jung-based typology instrument. And then for my survey itself, the ACC 10 factor, this is something that I built, and I built this over the years. I started it for one client in particular, and this was, I don't know, 7 years ago or something like that. And that client, it was so useful in terms of the way we were able to map type against answers, which was so cool. And from this assessment, we also have something we call an individualized leadership plan. And so we build an individualized leadership plan. So Ramel, if you want to email me, info@adaptivechallengeconsulting.com, you can do that. Otherwise, everybody, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your participation. And I hope to engage with you all next week. Take care.